The neon-lit streets of the virtual city offered no warmth to those at the absolute bottom of the gaming food chain. For 14 consecutive hours, Lee Kiho had hunted nothing but low-level slimes in the damp outer marshes. His inventory screen flickered open to reveal a pathetic handful of common gel drops and broken rusty nails. The abysmal drop rates of Circuit seemed engineered specifically to torment impoverished solo players like him. With his real-world rent overdue and his capsule subscription expiring in days, failure meant complete ruin. He counted his remaining currency, finding exactly 10 gleaming gold coins left to his name. This meager sum was the absolute entirety of his remaining lifelines in this unforgiving virtual world. Instead of buying basic rations, Kiho turned his steps toward the notorious glowing Gacha pavilion. The pavilion was a temple of broken dreams, where countless players lost everything to volatile algorithms. He approached a sleek, high-tier item machine that gleamed with enticing, deceptive patterns of light. A single random pull cost exactly 10 gold coins, requiring him to wager his entire survival on a single spin. Rational players would call this madness, but a slow death by hunting slimes was no alternative at all. With a sudden, forceful movement born of utter desperation, his fingers slammed down onto the console. The 10 gold coins vanished from his display instantly, leaving his account balance at a hollow zero. Inside the machine, the massive crystal sphere began to revolve with an ominous, mechanical grind. Standard drop indicators flashed common gray, then uncommon green, teasing the usual garbage results. Kiho braced himself for the inevitable system message confirming another worthless piece of low-tier iron scrap. Suddenly, the mechanical grinding halted with a violent, resounding crash that shook the stone floor. The glass sphere did not flash rare blue or epic purple. Instead, it began to shudder with violent energy. A deep, resonant hum vibrated through the air, forcing nearby players to turn around in sheer confusion. The system interface of the entire pavilion glitched violently, overriding all standard operational parameters. From the core of the fractured sphere, a blinding pillar of stellar light erupted straight toward the ceiling. The intense force of the magical shockwave pushed Kiho back several steps, his boots skidding across the floor. Within the heart of that roaring pillar of light, a small object began to descend with slow, graceful majesty. Crimson text boxes, reserved only for world-altering events, materialized across his entire field of vision. A booming server-wide announcement echoed through the minds of every single active player in Circuit. The system declared that the first-ever legendary-grade artifact from the Polarum set had been claimed. As the blinding pillar of light gradually receded, it left behind the floating, radiating necklace. The star of Polarum hummed with an ancient power, its central violet crystal pulsing like a living heart. Kiho could hear the frantic whispers and heavy footsteps of other players rushing toward his location. Realizing the immense danger of being spotted, he snatched the legendary artifact out of the air. The moment his skin contacted the metal, a searing jolt of raw magical energy surged up his arm. Ignoring the burning sensation, he shoved the artifact into his hidden personal inventory slot. He turned on his heel and melted into the shadows of a rear exit just as the first crowd arrived. Running through the labyrinthine side streets, his heart hammered against his ribs like a trapped bird. If a high-level guild discovered that a penniless nobody possessed a legendary item, they would hunt him endlessly. He finally reached the safety of his cramped, cheap rented room in the city's poorest slum sector. Slumping against the door, he let himself slide down onto the floor, gasping heavily for breath. With trembling fingers, Kiho reopened his private inventory to look upon the prize that changed everything. The detailed stat panel materialized, but instead of standard attributes, it displayed a terrifying hidden restriction. The pulsing crimson text on the floating stat panel warned that equipping the artifact would forcefully reconstruct his avatar's internal energy core. Ignoring the systemic danger warning, Kiho firmly clamped his fingers around the star of Polarum and pressed it directly against his bare chest. A sudden surge of liquid lightning erupted from the necklace, throwing his head back as golden circuit lines fractured across his neck. He dropped heavily onto his knees, clenching the floorboard so tightly that the aged wood began to splinter beneath his fingernails. The intense heat subsided after several grueling minutes, leaving him gasping for breath in a pool of dark, purged systemic impurities. Standing up cautiously, he realized his sensory perception had expanded tenfold, allowing him to hear the faint scuffling of mice beneath the floorboards. A brand new gold-bordered notification confirmed that his base physical attributes had permanently multiplied by 300%. With his newfound strength flowing smoothly through his veins, he strapped his worn iron shortsword to his leather belt and headed outside. The bustling town square of the starting village was packed with anxious low-level players reading a massive public bulletin board. Kiho pushed through the dense crowd to read the glowing announcement regarding an emergency community subjugation quest. A massive giant troll had migrated into the nearby Black Forest, threatening to lock down the regional trade routes permanently. Realizing this high-level threat was the perfect opportunity to test his upgraded combat limits, Kiho quickly accepted the raid invitation. He purchased several cheap mana potions from a nearby traveling merchant, packing them carefully into his leather rucksack. The atmospheric lighting shifted dramatically as he crossed the outer threshold of the settlement and entered the eerie woods. Gnarled black roots twisted along the muddy ground like frozen serpents, catching the boots of careless players marching ahead. Dozens of heavily armored warriors vanguard the group, their polished steel shields forming a defensive wall against potential ambushes. Kiho hung back near the rear flank, observing the chaotic coordination of the unorganized public raid group with calculating eyes. A sudden earth-shattering roar echoed through the valley, causing flocking black crows to scatter into the gray sky. The ground trembled violently as a massive uprooted pine tree crashed through the thick brush, flattening two vanguard scouts instantly. Out of the dense white fog stepped the giant troll, its skin covered in thick moss and glowing blue runes of regeneration. The raid leader shouted frantic orders, telling the ranged mages to prepare their fire spells to halt the beast's healing factor. With a swift horizontal swing of its club, the troll shattered the front-line shields, sending players flying into the dark trees. Healers scrambled backward, their hands glowing with soft green light as they desperately tried to patch up the dying tanks. Kiho noticed that every time the troll swung its heavy weapon, its left knee buckled slightly due to an unhealed old wound. Darting out from behind his cover, Kiho used his enhanced agility to sprint across the battlefield like a blur of dark lightning. He slid directly underneath the troll's next colossal stomp, narrowly avoiding being crushed into a pulp by the heavy leather boot. Driving his basic iron sword deep into the soft tissue of the troll's weak knee joint, he unleashed his artifact's raw physical force. The giant troll roared in genuine agony as the hidden force shattered its kneecap, forcing its massive body to crash down onto one side. The remaining raid players stopped their attacks in absolute shock, staring at the lone slime hunter who had just brought down the boss. Seizing the moment, Kiho scrambled up the creature's thick leather armor plates, using the straps and spikes as handholds. The troll thrashed wildly against the surrounding trees, trying desperately to scrape the annoying human off its broad back. Reaching the nape of the monster's neck, Kiho held his sword inverted with both hands, channeling every drop of his remaining mana into the blade. He plunged the empowered blade straight down into the creature's spine, sending a shockwave of golden energy rippling through its entire nervous system. The giant troll stiffened instantly before dissolving into thousands of glittering gray data fragments that floated up into the dark canopy. A stream of high-level experience points flooded into Kiho's profile, accompanied by the satisfying chime of several level-up notifications. Before the other shell-shocked players could recover their senses, Kiho snatched a rare heavy steel chest that dropped onto the mud. Angry murmurs quickly spread among the high-level guild players who felt an unranked solo player had stolen their rightful glory. Not wanting to get bogged down in a tedious territorial dispute, Kiho turned on his heel and sprinted deep into the uncharted forest tracks. He traveled for hours until the angry shouting of the raid party completely faded, replaced by the eerie silence of ancient wilderness. The ground suddenly crumbled beneath his feet, dropping him down into a pitch-black underground cavern lined with decaying stone structures. He landed heavily on a pile of ancient bones, the impact knocking the wind out of his chest and cracking his iron sword completely in half. Thousands of glowing crimson eyes slowly opened in the deep darkness surrounding him, accompanied by the terrifying sound of rattling armor plates. A heavy stone portcullis slammed shut behind him automatically, trapping him inside the ancient military mass grave with no clear exit path. A massive system prompt flashed before his eyes, declaring that he had mistakenly entered a restricted, unmapped unique boss zone. From the center of the mass grave, a giant skeletal general clad in decaying black armor began to rise, its gaze locking onto Kiho's necklace. The massive skeletal general fully emerged from the mountain of bones, its glowing red eyes locking directly onto Lee Kiho's chest. Kiho instantly felt a heavy, suffocating pressure crush down upon his shoulders as the system interface flashed a bright crimson warning. The ancient floorboards and scattered remains beneath his boots vibrated violently from the sheer power of the undead creature. Gritting his teeth, Kiho tightened his grip on his iron sword and prepared his body for an immediate evasive maneuver. With a deafening roar that shook the very foundation of the ruins, the skeletal monster swung its massive burning blade downward. The heavy blade shattered the stone floor where Kiho had been standing just a fraction of a second prior. As Kiho tumbled across the dusty floor, the star of Polarum necklace pulsed with a bright violet energy that temporarily blinded the monster. Seizing the temporary distraction, Kiho scrambled to his feet and bolted down a narrow, dark corridor leading away from the main chamber. The furious, heavy footsteps of the giant general echoed right behind him, accompanied by the clattering of hundreds of lesser skeletons rising from the dirt. Multiple bony hands burst directly through the crumbling brick walls of the corridor, reaching desperately for Kiho's armor. He slashed through the grasping limbs with rapid, precise strikes, refusing to let the undead horde slow his momentum. Suddenly, the narrow corridor opened up into a massive, forgotten underground library coated in centuries of dust and grime. Seeking a temporary defensive position, Kiho ducked beneath a massive fallen stone archway and scanned the silent room. On a large stone altar in the center of the archive, a thick leather-bound book emitted a faint, glowing red text prompt. Kiho stepped toward the altar cautiously, keeping his ears alert for any signs of the pursuing skeletal general. As his fingers touched the ancient leather cover, a system notification materialized before his eyes, revealing hidden game lore. The text described the Crimson Regiment, an elite group of ancient soldiers who were betrayed and massacred by their own corrupt king. According to the records, their unyielding hatred transformed the entire ruined garrison into a perpetual breeding ground for high-level undead. Kiho realized that the skeletal general pursuing him was none other than the corrupted commander of that betrayed military force. Suddenly, a loud explosion shattered the entrance of the library, showering the room in sharp stone shards. The giant skeletal general stepped through the smoke, its armor coated in dark green flames that consumed the surrounding bookshelves. Knowing he could no longer run, Kiho turned away from the altar and faced the massive undead monster head-on. The Star of Polarum responded to his resolve, shifting into an offensive state and coating his simple iron blade in a brilliant purple aura. With an earth-shattering stomp, the skeletal general closed the distance instantly, swinging its sword in a devastating horizontal slash. Kiho leaped high into the air, narrowly dodging the burning blade, which sliced clean through 3 massive stone pillars behind him. Descending rapidly, Kiho channeled all his strength and brought his empowered purple blade down directly onto the general's shoulder armor. A massive shockwave erupted from the impact point, shattering the general's heavy black armor and causing the monster to stumble backward. A giant health bar appeared above the creature's head, showing a noticeable chunk of its health pool dropping instantly. However, the monster quickly recovered, its red eyes flaring with an even more intense, vengeful light. It slammed its fist into the ground, summoning an array of sharp bone spikes that erupted violently from beneath Kiho's feet. One of the jagged bone spikes grazed Kiho's thigh, tearing through his leather armor and causing his own health bar to flash dangerously. Ignoring the sharp sting, Kiho used a fallen bookshelf as a springboard to launch himself forward into a spinning attack. His rotating blade sliced clean through the general's extended skeletal arm, sending the monster's massive greatsword clattering to the floor. The legendary necklace surged once more, executing a structural passive ability that completely locked the boss monster's movement for 3 seconds. Realizing this was his golden opportunity, Kiho ran up the chest of the frozen giant, aiming his blade directly at its glowing skull core. With a final desperate cry, he thrust his sword deep into the eye socket of the general, unleashing the full accumulated power of the Star of Polarum. The entire skeletal structure shattered into thousands of harmless bone fragments that dissolved into glittering digital gold coins and drop items. Kiho collapsed onto his back, panting heavily as his stamina bar slowly regenerated in the quiet, ruined room. After a moment of rest, he stood up to inspect a unique dark metal key that had dropped from the general's remains. The key bore the coat of arms of Losvin, indicating a deeper connection between the corrupt guild and this ancient massacre. Deep within the back of the library, a heavy stone door marked with the exact same crest slowly began to grind open on its own. From the dark abyss beyond the doorway, a freezing, oppressive pressure far greater than the skeletal general suddenly swept over the entire room. A towering shadow with 2 glowing crimson eyes materialized inside the gateway, stepping forward with a slow, terrifying intent that chilled Kiho to the absolute bone. The colossal shadow stepped completely through the shattered gateway, revealing the towering, armor-clad figure of the Master of Losvin. Kiho gripped his weapon tightly as a suffocating aura of pure malice washed over the entire subterranean cavern. The Master of Losvin glared down at the assembled party, his voice echoing like grinding stones across the chamber. He spoke of the endless line of greedy players who had desecrated these sacred lands for nothing more than digital loot. Kiho checked his status window rapidly, realizing that their opponent possessed a level of power that defied the game's standard scaling. The Star of Polarum necklace around Kiho's neck began to pulse with a brilliant, protective violet light. Kiho shouted to his remaining allies to scatter into defensive positions before the first strike landed. With a sudden, explosive burst of speed, the Master of Losvin swung his massive broadsword, cleaving the air itself. A nearby mage barely managed to cast a magical shield, which instantly shattered under the immense physical pressure. Knowing they could not win in a direct assault, Kiho realized their only option was to stall for the countdown timer to expire. The boss laughed mockingly, stating that no amount of time would save the interlopers from his eternal wrath. Kiho lunged forward to draw the boss's attention away from the wounded spellcasters in the back. The heavy sword of Losvin slammed into the ground where Kiho stood a fraction of a second prior, obliterating the solid rock. Utilizing his maximized luck attribute, Kiho executed a perfectly timed parry that deflected a secondary concussive blast. An agile rogue member tried to blindside the giant armor, but was effortlessly swatted away by a backhand motion. The Master of Losvin ranted about the system's corruption, explaining how players treated this living history as a mere playground. Kiho listened intently to the boss's ideological hatred, understanding the tragic lore embedded within the game's code. However, Kiho countered by stating that survival was the ultimate goal for everyone regardless of the world they occupied. Infuriated by the response, the Master of Losven summoned an array of phantom blades that hovered ominously in the air. The phantom blades rained down upon the party, forcing Kiho to move at absolute maximum velocity to dodge the onslaught. The remaining party members used their final cooperative barrier spell to shield themselves from the devastating rain. Kiho noticed that the countdown timer on his interface had finally reached its last single minute. He decided to unleash the full, unmitigated power hidden within the Star of Polarum artifact for one final push. The Master of Losven sensed the sudden overwhelming spike in magical density and locked his gaze completely onto Kiho. The two forces collided in the center of the hall, creating a shockwave that threatened to collapse the entire cavern structure. Kiho felt his health pool dropping rapidly from the sheer kinetic feedback of the boss's counterattack. Thanks to his maxed luck attribute, a legendary critical evasion triggered at the absolute last possible millisecond. Seizing the opening, Kiho drove his empowered blade directly into a weak joint of the boss's massive armor plates. The Master of Losven stumbled backward, his iron grip loosening from his weapon for the first time in memory. At that exact moment, the countdown timer hit 0, and a massive divine golden seal materialized over the entire room. The system message flashed brightly, announcing the successful completion of the stalling objective and the forced pacification of the boss. The Master of Losven lowered his weapon completely, the crimson rage fading from his eyes to reveal a weary, ancient spirit. He acknowledged Kiho's immense resolve, stating that perhaps not all players were mindless locusts bent on destruction. As part of the unique Peaceful Resolution reward, the boss handed over an ancient scroll containing the forgotten history of Circuit. A fountain of legendary loot drops exploded into the air, securing Kiho's position as the absolute top hoarder in the game. The remaining allies cheered loudly, collapsing onto the stone floor in absolute relief after surviving the ordeal. The Master of Losven dissolved into harmless particles of blue light, finally finding the peace he had been denied for centuries. Kiho looked down at his inventory, knowing his days of poverty and hunting simple slimes were officially over forever. With his friends at his side and his legendary collection complete, he walked out of the deep ruins into a bright new dawn. Kiho had successfully rewritten his fate within Circuit, proving that even a trash-tier player could maximize luck to achieve legendary greatness.